Good morning, everyone. Welcome to to our today's webinar. This is, of course, the Smile CDR 2025.02.R01 release, as well as the HAPI FHIR 8.0.0. That's right, a major release bump for HAPI FHIR. We'll talk about some of the stuff that's going in there. We have got loads to talk about today. This is quite a big release, actually. We've got a bunch of really exciting features that I'm excited to talk to you about this morning. I will start by saying I am coming off personally a month of being sick. It's unbelievable. I managed to get COVID and that turned into a lung infection, and I'm finally feeling better this week. So thank goodness for that. It has been just a miserable month for me. So I'm very happy to be finally putting that in the rearview mirror and very excited to be talking to you today about today's Transfiguration release. Yeah, there we go. So I will say we're going to talk, as we always do, about what's new in the release for this quarter. We're going to talk a little bit about what's coming up in future releases, and unfortunately, we got a late-breaking change. Bryn was not able to join us. Bryn is at a conference, and I am suspecting he probably couldn't find a place with internet where he could sit and join us. So unfortunately, no Bryn. It's going to be Q&A with only James. I will, of course, be joined by Megan, as we always do. So she'll come up and join us in a little bit. So let's start with the name. We are departing from what we've been doing. So Smile, I guess we are 7 years old. I guess I probably should know that since I've been around since the start, but I think we're 7 years old. And since the start, we have always named our releases using alphabetical names where we go to the next letter in the alphabet. We've made it, at this point, we've done so many releases that we looped around and got back to A and started going through the alphabet a second time. This is a practice that's obviously pretty common in the software industry, and certainly especially in the open source software industry. This is a practice that gets used a fair bit. I don't know who started it. I kind of suspect it was the Ubuntu project that started it, but I don't actually know that that's true. We have decided to break from that. We are going to do release names with words that are, I will say, random, but they're not random at all. We've got a series of interesting release names this year. I'm kind of excited for them because they're all a little bit weird. But we've got, they do tell a story, and we've got reasons for picking them, and we will tell that story over the course of this year, so I'm excited for that. Today's release is the Transfiguration release, so we're starting with a bang. Pretty weird word. If you're not familiar with the word transfiguration, I have to admit I had to spend some time poring over the dictionary before this webinar to make sure that I could explain it correctly. The dictionary gave the closest synonym being metamorphosis, so I think that really helped me understand that. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Something shifting into a better form is effectively what we're talking about. And the reason we choose this, we're going to focus on the FHIR standard a little bit for talking about today's release. FHIR is a transfiguration of sort of healthcare data, healthcare practice, the healthcare experience for patients. We believe we are on the cusp of a revolution of all of these things. And we believe that FHIR is the thing that is catalyzing that transfiguration. There's a mouthful for you. I do love the examples that our marketing team came up with here. The notion that standardized time made it easier for coordinating travel, and standardized money, modernized our economies. These feel like very common sense examples of the power of standardization. And of course, as we move into this modern era of standard health data that is interoperable across jurisdictions, across organizations, across systems, across workflows, I mean, we're priming the pump for just an absolute revolution in our ability to take care of patients, to improve human health, to monitor human health, all of those good things. So I'm very excited to be a part of that. And there we go. Without further ado, let's start talking about the release. As always, we've got a release playlist. This is a playlist curated by a bunch of the developers who've contributed code to this release. There's some internal debate about whether this is our best release playlist ever. I don't know that I want to weigh in on that, but there have been a few people express opinions that this is the best one we've ever done. I'm going to say, as a note, the very first song in this playlist is mine, just because I was the fastest to the draw of supplying a song this time around. That's not usually the case, but there we go. Lots of good music in this playlist. I did listen to it this morning, and I really enjoyed it. So there we go. I will put the link up again at the end. So if you don't have time to catch it now, and you want to listen to a bunch of really scattered music from our developers, then you will have an opportunity to do that. Let's talk about what's new in the Transfiguration release. So I'm going to start by talking about documentation. A thing that I suspect probably a lot of people don't realize is that when we started Smile the company, obviously Smile came after HAPI FHIR, the open source project, but not by that long, truthfully. And one of our earliest goals with Smile was that we were going to be a documentation first company. We were going to have world class, super usable documentation. And a big part of that, we decided we were going to roll our own documentation platform. Whether that's a sensible decision, who knows? I mean, we certainly had a little bit of the old "not invented here" syndrome that developers tend to experience. But I've always been proud of our documentation. I think it's got some. I think it's got some really sort of, I don't know, usable traits, and it's well sort of laid out and things like that. So I've always been kind of proud of the documentation that we put forward. That said, we have made a bunch of improvements to that documentation platform over the course of this release. And most of these, or at least a bunch of them, have gone live in the last couple of weeks. So if you spend any time regularly on our documentation, you probably started to notice them. A couple of things that have changed. First off, for both the Smile CDR documentation and the HAPI FHIR documentation, you can now pick which release you want to look at documentation for. It used to be that we just showed the latest version on the page, but you can now go back and look at docs for old versions if you want to. We have redesigned our search box. And this is a funny thing. I don't know. I never want to admit that I wrote bad code, but there we go. I will certainly do that. The original full text search that that powered our documentation was I actually hand coded that, and I mean, certainly, I think in retrospect, hand coding a full text engine was a really bad use of time. So I don't know why I did that, but there we go. It was barely functional, but really not that great. We have replaced that with an Elasticsearch based backend, which is just vastly better than the old full text index. The new one now has weighted search results, weighted according to multiple search terms, and can look for phrases, shows you the results with your search phrases in context. I've got a little screenshot on the bottom right of what that looks like. So that's pretty cool. For Smile CDR users, I'll say we have started a process to reorganize our documentation as well. We're adding a bunch of guides and tutorials. This is very much a work in progress. There's a number of great guides in there already, but we've got a whole bunch more to write still. So lots to come. We've got some really interesting plans there for how we're going to sort of continue to evolve those guides and tutorials and the documentation. And then finally, on the documentation front, a new page has been added with our development forecast. So you can now look to our docs and learn what it is we're planning on working on for the next quarter and what we're hoping to work on in subsequent quarters as well. So that page has some interesting insights actually about what we're going to be working on. Moving on, so we've got a couple of major themes for this this release, and the number one theme that we've got is around scalability and performance. This is a topic that obviously I talk about quite a bit on these release webinars. We have made some major enhancements to scalability and performance for this release, and obviously this is an ongoing theme because people just continue to use these platforms in bigger and bigger solutions. We are introducing a new feature called database partition mode into this release. It's a simple on or off flag, which sort of behind that simple on-off flag is just a mountain of effort. The amount of coding effort that's gone in over the last quarter, it was actually started several quarters ago and just took a long time to reach maturity that we could get it merged, is pretty staggering. Ultimately, we've had support for partitioning within HAPI FHIR and Smile for quite a while. We introduced it initially in 2020. And the initial design goals for the original partitioning support were that any changes we made to our database schema had to be backwards compatible. In other words, we couldn't make breaking changes that would ruin someone's existing deployment of HAPI FHIR or Smile CDR for that matter. And that was an interesting constraint. It meant that we couldn't make changes to primary keys or foreign key constraints, sort of basic database considerations. And it did mean that it was very difficult to layer that partitioning on top of native partitioning capabilities and native sharding capabilities provided by the underlying database platforms. For example, Postgres has a feature called table partitioning. It was very difficult to use that in combination with HAPI FHIR's partitioning mode. Just because we did not sort of include the partition keys in primary key definitions and things like that. This new mode changes all that. It is not, the aim is not that we're breaking backwards compatibility. Anyone who is using our existing schema can continue to, and we're not going to get rid of it at any point. But anyone who is starting a brand new deploy has the option of starting that deployment in this new database partitioning mode, and you will get support for a whole bunch of better capabilities for, I don't know, efficient partitioning, taking advantage of underlying capabilities. This means that all primary keys and foreign keys include the partition ID, all select and where clauses and join clauses will include it. This just allows the database to be a whole lot more efficient when you're using partitioning. This is layered on top of our existing partitioning capability, so it solves all of the same problems. You can use it for multi-tenancy, you can use it for scalability, you can use it for geo-replication. All of the same use cases apply, but probably with even better performance at even bigger scale. So I think that's a really good thing. I will say for now, you can only use this new mode in brand new deployments. We are going to think about sort of providing a migration tool that would allow you to migrate an existing repository into database partition mode, but we truthfully haven't even started thinking about that. So I don't even know for sure it'll be possible. I suspect it will be though. So we will, more to come on that in future releases. We are now testing HAPI FHIR against native Postgres partitioning. We've got unit tests that verify it for every single release. We've got some manual tests as well. We provide a sample schema that includes a partitioned set of tables. You can base your own design on that schema, or you can customize it if you want to take advantage of different features of Postgres's underlying partitioning. And we are intending over the next little while to add support for SQL Server for MSSQL as well. So by the May release, we will probably have some native tests for MSSQL as well. On the Smile CDR front, we have added support, which is layered on top of this database partition mode and actually adds some additional configuration flags and an extra customized schema. Using that, we have enabled support for the new Azure Cosmos for Postgres, which is effectively an unlimited scale replicated database provided by Microsoft Azure's cloud platform. We're very excited about this. The ability to support that platform using Smile CDR means that you've got the ability to grow your FHIR repository to effectively unlimited scale. So I think that's going to be really exciting. Amazon have recently gone GA with what they call Amazon's Aurora for Postgres Limitless, which is a similar, it's not identical, but it is a similar concept. It's a Postgres-backed database, which it can replicate itself and scale up to, again, almost unlimited scale. We intend over the course of this quarter to test that as well. So by the end of, or by May, we will have full GA support within Smile CDR for both Azure Cosmos for Postgres and Amazon Aurora for Postgres Limitless. Oh my goodness. So if you're interested in testing either of those things, I mean, do get in touch with us. We'd love to talk to you about that. I will say as a part of these changes, we are deprecating support for partition date. The original partition design had both a partition ID and a partition date. We are dropping at some point, at this point, we're deprecating support for partition date just because it's been pretty sparsely used. If you've got a use case that is critical, that needs that feature critically, we would love to hear from you, just because as far as we can tell, people don't need that feature, and that's therefore it's kind of makes sense to drop it. I will say I've sort of hinted at this already, but this is the initial release of this new feature. It has a couple of known issues, and I'm sure there are bugs lurking that we haven't yet surfaced either. I do expect a significant amount of hardening to happen over the course of this coming quarter. So May is going to be certainly a much more stable version of database partition mode. But I do hope people will start taking it for a spin and testing it and giving us feedback so that we know what's broken and what works well, and can start incorporating feedback into the release. So do consider testing it. The second thing I want to mention on the scalability and performance front is we have made a number of massive improvements to the transaction processing module. Transaction bundles are obviously pretty much the best way of doing large-scale data ingestion into the system, both for backloads and for ongoing sort of data loads. We've made a bunch of improvements to them. Not the first time we've had an announcement like this, but we just keep on finding things we can make it more efficient and keep on finding improvements to make. So a bunch of those have gone into this release as well. For bundles that have a number of references to external resources, in other words, if you are submitting a bundle with, let's say, 1,000 observation resources. And all of those observation resources have references to patients, and it's all different patients, and those patients don't appear in the bundle. That's what I mean by external references. And this is a fairly common pattern we found. We will now prefetch all of those references in a single action at the very start of transaction processing. It is staggering what a difference makes for that specific pattern. I'll talk about some numbers in a slide or two, but this just makes a huge difference if that is the specific pattern you're using when you're doing data ingestion. We've also added a bunch of more aggressive caching for previously seen resources. This is useful if you've got lots of bundles and perhaps multiple resources refer to resources from one bundle, refer to resources that were created in a previous bundle. If that's the sort of scenario you've got, we do a whole lot of caching now that sort of enables us to avoid some lookups in the database, which also does a fair bit of help. And then finally, if you're using mass ingestion mode, mass ingestion mode is a feature in both Smile and HAPI that can be used if you're doing huge backloads and want the system to work as efficiently as possible. Sort of tunes the system for writes at the expense of read performance. So really, this is useful mostly for when you're doing large scale writes before you go live. That's typically when this gets used. We will now no longer fetch the previous resource body because it actually doesn't get used. We consider all updates to be new updates in mass ingestion mode. A couple of other random changes we've made as far as performance and scalability goes in this release. We have made a change that means you can no longer undelete a resource if deletes are disabled. It used to be that if deletes were disabled, you could delete resources. You couldn't delete resources, but you could restore a previously deleted resource. Adding this new check, which sort of prevents you from undeleting a resource when deletions are disabled. The reason we do this is this allows for much more heavily aggressive caching of resource identities, because we can trust that if something wasn't deleted the last time we looked it up, it still isn't deleted, and vice versa. And this means that we avoid a whole category of lookups. So this makes some significant performance improvements when you've got deletes disabled. And certainly, if you're trying to build a system with high performance, I will say that disabling deletes is often it can make a pretty significant difference, just because of the number of deletion checks that we don't need to perform for system integrity when you've disabled deletes. So do consider doing that if you know you're not going to need deletes. We've also dropped 2 foreign key constraints on one of our database tables, the resource link table. Those constraints, we've sort of moved the checking into the application tier. We made this change because we discovered that there was some significant contention under certain sort of write scenarios on Postgres, where dropping these constraints made just a world of difference in terms of performance. So again, if you're doing any kind of day loads on Postgres, you'll see a pretty heavy performance improvement in many cases. And then finally, if you're updating resources and you're using what we call versioned tag mode, we have a previously sort of redundant lookup of the unversioned tags has been optimized away. So that should improve performance for updates of existing resources in version tag mode. I thought that was the last slide, but nope, there's a couple more things on performance. We have added, so about a year ago, we added some columns to our resource version table that duplicated the data that used to be stored in this dedicated provenance table. And the provenance table is used specifically for indexing the value in meta.source. In other words, and that powers the underscore source search parameter. If you don't use the underscore search parameter in your application, this won't affect you in any way. But I will say, we added this new dedicated column about a year ago, and we are now dropping use of the old provenance table. If you've got data in your database that was created in a version of Smile over a year old at this point, and you want to use the underscore source search parameter, if both of those things apply, you may need to run a reindex on your data in order to continue using the source search parameter. This again was done for performance reasons. It avoids an extra join in many of our searches, so has yielded some good performance improvements. And I think the underscore source search parameter is fairly sparsely used in the real world, so I think this is a pretty good change. We've got tons of stuff. I keep forgetting how much is in here in terms of performance. On validation front, so I've been talking about data loads so far. Now changing gears to doing validation. Our validation support system, which is the little submodule which fetches things like structure definitions and terminology code validations and lookups and I don't know, those types of things. All of that is provided by a subsystem called the validation support system. That system also handles calling remote terminology services, if that's a thing you're using. There's all kinds of things that this module does. It previously had these two modules called the validation support chain and the caching validation support. Those two modules have been collapsed into a single module. Basically, they both of their functionality now exists inside validation support chain, and caching validation support is no longer does anything and can be removed from your application because all of its functionality is provided by the chain. We do this because it actually allows a sort of combination of the validation support module chain and the caching module. When we put them together, it allows us to be a whole lot more efficient in terms of what we cache and which of the chained modules we use when, because we can cache which module was able to handle which request. Kind of a complicated thing to explain on in 5 seconds on a call, but I will say this optimized caching, it makes a world of difference in a bunch of validation scenarios. We've seen some really significant performance improvements, and I'll talk about those in just a second. We've also gone through and replaced a number of one-off in-memory caches that are sort of scattered around our code base. We've moved them into our central memory cache service, which is a central place for caching. That change doesn't have any real user visible changes or impacts at this point, but they're important just because our future plans for the memory cache service are to add open telemetry monitoring and better configurability on the cache sizes, and perhaps even replication across cache instances at some point. So we've got a bunch of plans for that. Okay, here's what I was looking for. Getting to the numbers, and I'm really excited about this. We've done a bunch of benchmarking of the performance improvements, literally from our previous release, from our November release to this February release. And what we found, if you are doing large-scale data ingestion using FHIR transaction bundles with those what I was calling external resource references. Our testing shows that this release can be up to, and often is, exactly twice as fast at ingesting those. It's a really significant improvement. Similarly, if you have bundles that have lots of related resources, the best example of that is a bundle containing a patient and then all of the data about that patient. That's the pattern that Cynthia data, for example, uses. That is about 20% faster in this release than it was previously. So obviously not doubling, but still a non-trivial improvement. Validation workflows, as a result of all those caching changes, validation is now twice as fast for many validation scenarios. Adding these caches and making them more efficient just makes so much difference to how quickly we can do validation. And most importantly, if you're using remote terminology services, so if you've got, perhaps you've got Smile CDR paired with an Onto server terminology server to handle your terminology validation. That's a pretty popular combination these days, and one that I particularly love personally. If that is a scenario you're using, all of this enhanced validation, we have seen validation benchmarks show a 10 times speed improvement. So a very, very non-trivial improvement for that specific scenario. So if you do validation, definitely consider upgrading to this release. There is a whole lot of performance improvement in there for you. Changing gears entirely, our next theme is around security. We are introducing a new module in Smile CDR called the consent module. This is work that has been ongoing over the course of a couple of releases, and it's finally sort of baked enough that we're able to announce it. I am super excited about that. Traditionally, consent rules have been applied in both Smile CDR and HAPI FHIR using the consent interceptor. The consent interceptor, it's not going away. It remains an important part of our consent functionality framework. The consent interceptor, though, it's a great API, but it does require you to spend quite a bit of development effort implementing your rules. It's very flexible, which is great, but it requires significant development if you want to use it. This new consent module is intended to be sort of an implementation of a consent service that is entirely, or at least almost entirely, sort of driven by configuration and by consent resources and security labels on your data. So in other words, it's data and configuration driven as opposed to being code driven. This is useful because it allows you to get going a whole lot faster with the system. And in many ways, it allows you to sort of create fairly complicated consent scenarios in a much more intuitive way because you're working with sort of fairly basic configuration. We've added a tutorial to our documentation that sort of walks you through how you would use this new module to implement patient self-management of their own consent rules. There's a little test UI that a patient can log into. They can create rules. They can put blocks on their data. They can unblock data. They can block individual users from seeing their data, and then you can sort of log in as those users and see the impacts of that. This is all just a basic sort of example of how this new consent module can be used. There's all kinds of other uses for this thing. So I am just beyond excited to see this thing come to life. Yeah, there we go. So this is a little bit of a diagram for the documentation. Do consider taking this for a spin. You know, if consent rules are the kind of thing that gets you excited, I mean, anyone security-minded should, it is worth spending some time looking at this new consent module. It is a really exciting feature in terms of managing data. Moving on to the next theme, which is data management, I'm going to talk a little bit about deduplication features. We are adding a new operation. It's funny. I mean, this is a single bullet point about one FHIR operation. So it sounds minor, but I think this is a huge sort of a move forward in this this release. We're adding the $merge operation, which can be used to collapse multiple FHIR resources into a single resource. I've struggled a little bit with how to explain why you would use the merge operation, and I decided the best way to explain it was to talk about the two sort of tools we've got in our toolbox for data management today. One is MDM. So the MDM module is all about creating links between equivalent records, you know, and it doesn't destroy data, it doesn't merge data, it just creates links between equivalent data. And of course, if you've got multiple source systems sending you data, and there's a possibility that those source systems might both send you data, you know, a record that sort of corresponds to the same real world thing. Maybe two different systems are sending you patient resources, and you know that two of these patients refer to the same real world person. That's a great candidate for MDM. On the other hand, the merge operation takes two resources, deletes one of those resources, and then looks for all of the references to the deleted resource and repoints them at the surviving resource. This is useful for sort of cleanup exercises. You know, if you've got data that has been entered in error and you want it to just go away and be deleted, the merge operation is the way to do that. So obviously a very different purpose from MDM, but I think the two of them are, they're not intended to be sort of exclusive choices. I think they're both sort of, as I think we say at the start, they're both tools in your toolbox for doing data management. And as people sort of build more and more powerful systems on top of the FHIR repository, these tools become, I mean, they're almost inevitable that you need to use them to manage the real world complexity of modeling health data. The second thing we're doing around data management is implementing this new feature called MDM virtualized endpoint, or MDM virtualization, I guess I'm calling it here. MDM virtualized endpoint it's a little bit of a tricky one to explain, and I'll show you a picture in just a second. But it is a FHIR endpoint that sits in front of an MDM-enabled repository where all of the linkages, all of that MDM linking activity that's going on is completely sort of automatically rationalized in the return data, in a way where the client does not need to be aware that there's an MDM system, doesn't need to be aware that there are duplicate records or that, you know, things exist. All of that gets cleaned up automatically by the virtualized endpoint. So the client sees a standard endpoint where everything has been harmonized and looks clean, and all of the heavy lifting is being done behind the scenes with the MDM virtualized endpoint. Just to give a simple example, because this is always a hard one to explain, I'm showing you a FHIR query here. This is a search for patient/123, and I'm going to include the patient as well, the subject of that observation. Let's say that in our system, we've got two patients. I'm showing this patient 123, and I'm showing patient 456. I'm not actually sure if you can see my mouse cursor or not. Let's say that patient 123 and 456 have an MDM linkage between the two of them. So we're searching for patient 123, and we're looking for their observations. And we know that there's a linked patient, and they've got two other observations as well. In that scenario, for a normal endpoint, of course, you're only going to get the patient you searched for and their observations. In a virtualized endpoint, what you're going to end up seeing is that first patient and all of the observations that belong to any of the linked patients, where the linked observations are being rewritten so they point to the patient that was actually searched for. There is a whole lot of interesting complexity that's going on underneath the covers there, but hopefully, you know, just seeing this example helps to sort of visualize the concept here. This allows clients which don't know anything about MDM to talk to rich MDM-enabled data sources and, you know, access all of the data that's in there without needing to understand the complexity of MDM. Super exciting feature. I'm quite excited to see people start to take for a spin. We've had some really interesting customer scenarios take advantage of this already. In the world of CDA Exchange Plus, lots of work going on there. We continue to hammer away at features for the CDA Exchange Plus module. We are now adding support for really, really cool, actually, export and generation of CDA documents. So, you know, our first big focus for the CDA Exchange Plus module was taking CDA documents and converting them into FHIR. We're now turning our attention, I mean, we're continuing to focus on that first focus as well, but we're now also turning our attention to generating CDA documents based on FHIR data in a repository. Whether or not that data came from other CDA documents doesn't matter. If you've got FHIR data, we're starting to create the ability for you to create CCDA documents using it. This initial release supports the CCDA discharge summary document, and we will be adding more as time goes, but discharge summary is by far the most popular of the CCDA documents, or at least it's the one we've had the most requests for. So there we go. This includes all kinds of things. It includes gathering data capabilities and curation of data that's going to go in those documents. It also includes very robust narrative generation. And there's some interesting synergies there. I'll talk a little bit sort of about the behind the scenes work. A lot of this is actually building on top of the work that we did for the IPS generator that I've spoken about in a bunch of our previous releases. So we are starting to see some interesting harmonies there and starting to realize that that IPS generation capability is not only useful for IPS, which I think is kind of exciting. We've also introduced a new operation to this module, which can generate a CDA document based on a FHIR document bundle or a composition resource. So if you've already got a FHIR document, we can now turn that into CDA as well. Exciting stuff. In the world of searching, obviously the most popular feature in any good FHIR server is the ability to do searching. It's always the first thing people play with. We've made lots of enhancements, as we often do. First off, we've added a new extension that allows you to declare that a search parameter should be indexed but not used for searches. That might sound weird to you. I'll explain it by sort of giving the main use case, which is combo search parameters. Remember that combo search parameters are search parameters which index a combination of other search parameters. They can be used to enforce uniqueness or just to speed up your searching. So if you've got these three other search parameters that you always use together, then you can create a combo search parameter that allows us to index that in a way that will search much more efficiently for the combination. However, if you create this combo search parameter, you definitely don't want anyone using it until it has been fully indexed. So this new extension allows you to do exactly that, to disable the search parameter for searching until the indexing is finished. Secondly, it is now possible for the full text search engine to be configured in a way where we will index the terminology, but not the full text content. So in other words, we won't do the indexing which supports the underscore content and underscore text search parameters. It used to be that this was all or nothing, which was problematic for anyone who wanted terminology, the more powerful capabilities of the terminology server with full text, but didn't want the wasted space of resource full text indexing. So it is now possible to split those two things up. Finally, on this front, if you're doing very large searches, in other words, you're doing searches which are pulling back like hundreds of thousands of resources, we've moved the deduplication process out of the application tier and into the database, which makes that a whole lot more efficient. As we've been doing the last few releases, we've got a bunch of great contributions that have come from external contributors, from people in the HAPI FHIR community that saw a problem and decided to help fix it. We love these contributions, and we thank all of the contributors like crazy for everything that they have done, especially when they're they include documentation and pull and tests and all that jazz that needs to go into pull requests. So we thank everyone for sticking to it. First off, tag definitions used to get, when you were creating a resource and it had a tag that we'd never seen before, we used to fire up a second thread in a dedicated thread pool for managing tag creations, the tag definition creations. Ibrahim Talouzi from Trifork pointed out this was really no longer necessary and was hampering some of his use cases. So he has made a change that does away with that. This actually makes tag processing in general a whole lot more efficient for writes. So I think it's a very good change. Michael Sebzik has contributed a change which allows, through configuration, for subscription processing to happen synchronously instead of asynchronously. Traditionally, we do subscription processing asynchronously, which is much better for server scalability, but can be problematic if you've got smaller amounts of data, but real-time sort of needs are more important to you. So that's now a configuration option. Jens Valadson, also of Trifork, has contributed a really interesting fix to the basic audit log pattern, the BALP audit capture interceptor, which implements the IHE audit profile for FHIR. We will now generate one audit event per resource owner, which I think makes this interceptor much closer to the design intent of the IHE specification in the first place. So thank you, Jens, for that. Second one from Ibrahim is, and this is actually a really interesting thing. HAPI FHIR for years now has been all of our client work, like the FHIR client, has been based on Apache's HTTP Client 4 framework. Apache released an incompatible sort of next generation framework called the Apache HTTP Client 5. And Ibrahim has contributed a version of HAPI FHIR's client framework, which uses this new Apache backing HTTP client. We haven't made this the default yet, but I do suspect at some point, probably in the next year, we will actually make this the default client because it is the next version of the backing HTTP framework. That's a bit of a mouthful. And then finally, thank you to Mangala, who has contributed a change to our JPA persistent validation support. This basically means that anyone who's doing validation where you've got, for example, a structure definition that references a specific version of another structure definition that's stored in your repository, we can now search for it even if it's got a version URL, which is in other words a URL that has a pipe and a version number at the very end of it. So thank you to Mangala for that. A couple of changes on the Camel module to talk about. We have upgraded to the latest version of Camel, which is exciting. That allows us to take advantage of all of the new fixes that are in upstream Camel itself. And then two changes to our Smile processors, which we built into Camel. First off, the bundle processor component, which you can use to build Camel routes that process FHIR transaction bundles. Yet again, we're talking about those things. They are very popular in terms of ingesting data. We've added several new parameters to that processor. A couple of them are around retries. So you can now specify how many retries you want the system to do. If you've got, if you're running into collisions because your data perhaps has some duplicates in it or something like that. You can configure the delay between retries. You can also configure the system to perform the very final retry as a batch, even if the bundle is a transaction bundle. This is useful if perhaps you know that maybe individual resources within your bundle may have problems, but you want to ingest as many of those resources as you can. Using that flag allows you to get all of the performance benefits of transaction, but also not be forced to use the all or nothing aspect of it if the occasional resource is going to fail. We've also added a new processor to our Camel module, which allows you to manually perform Kafka commits. There's a bunch of examples of this in documentation, but effectively this allows you to create an absolutely ensured guaranteed delivery configuration using Camel, which is a good thing. A couple of other odds and ends changes. We are now considering the device resource to be a part of the patient compartment for FHIR R4. It's a strange sounding change. Effectively, the reason here is the FHIR base specification. I think in error. I think this was an oversight originally, but it's probably too late to do anything about it in the base specification. That specification did not consider the device resource to be a part of the patient compartment, even though that resource has a patient element in it. The problem here is that a number of implementation guides, things like the DaVinci implementation guides, do consider the device resource to be a part of the patient compartment, and many of their test suites sort of will test you on whether your system is using device as a part of the patient compartment. So we've decided just to make that change right in base HAPI. So both HAPI and Smile will now consider the device resource to be a part of that component. If you use the NPM package registry module, either in HAPI FHIR or in Smile, you can now search by package author and package version. That is in addition to the existing attributes we already supported. And finally, we've added a couple of new point cuts to the CDA hooks module, which allows you to add your own logic around prefetch requests, both before and after, and also handle errors if you want to. Changing gears from the HTTP platform, on our compliance and automation pillar, which is effectively our CMS suite. This is all of the tools used by payers for CMS compliance. We've made a couple of changes there. We have added basically the ability to do updates to existing submissions for prior authorization submission. And then for CDEX, the clinical document exchange component of prior authorization, we've now got the ability for providers to submit attachments and complete questionnaires with additional information that's required. So that prior authorization solution continues to mature. It's got some exciting new stuff in it. Finally, and normally Bryn would be doing this slide. Hopefully I can do it justice, because Bryn, as I said before, wasn't able to join us. A couple of changes to our clinical quality intelligence suite. We, I guess most importantly, the first thing on the slide, we are now able, if a measure evaluation, so measure evaluation is a batch job, and a batch job which often takes quite a long time to complete if you're running against large populations of patients. That operation, if it encounters errors, will now flag those errors, but it will not abort, which is a really good thing. This means that you don't lose all your work if you're running a huge job and there's just one data issue, for example. In the DQM, the Digital Quality Measures UI, it's now possible to search your submissions by organization, which I think is a very useful thing if you've got submissions for lots of organizations in your system. We've got the ability to do capability expansion for prospective care gaps and multi-measure processing. I have to admit, I don't totally know what that one means. I hope I did that justice. I probably didn't. And then I certainly know what the last one means. We now support TLS end-to-end termination in the DQM product. So obviously a very good thing for security, probably long asked for by our users. We've got one event to talk about. We will be at HIMSS. I know we've got a bunch of people that are at several conferences, including the VIVE conference. Well, I guess that was last week, actually, but we had a bunch of people at VIVE last week. We will be at HIMSS in a couple of weeks. And, oddly enough, I will be at HIMSS in a couple of weeks as well. I don't typically go to HIMSS. It's been a couple of years since I've been, but I decided this year there was enough reason for me to go. I'm actually going to do a couple of talks on some of the features that I've spoken about in today's release webinar, and I'm certainly very excited for that. I would love to talk to you. If you're going to HIMSS, Smile in general, of course, would love to chat with you. And we've got lots of people coming that would love to chat with you. If you're interested in talking with me personally, I'm always very happy to do that as well. So I don't know, shoot me a note if you're going to be at HIMSS. Let's chat. So there we go. That is the end of the slides. This was a big release, as I said at the start. I normally try to keep this to half an hour, and we've actually gone to 40 minutes, which is longer than this typically takes. Thank you to everyone joining us. Again, here's a link to the release playlist. I'm going to leave this up, so don't worry about racing to it. As always, we've got our HAPI FHIR community and our LinkedIn page for Smile. And if you really are paying attention, you'll notice that I've dropped my Mastodon account from this slide because I just have to admit I've not done a good job with that particular social media. So there's not much interesting on there about me. So there we go. I'd like to welcome to the stage Megan Peet, a long-time Smiler who has done all kinds of cool things and is our webinar host extraordinaire. Welcome, Megan.
Hello, I'm excited to be here, as every time I get to be here. I did get a couple of reports that the QR code did not work for the webinar link, but we have confirmed that this link works. So if you're able to type that in, that will get you to the release playlist. And I've listened to this one in advance for once as well. And yeah, it's a pretty good one this time around. I'm just going to jump right into questions though, because we've got less time today. We've got a couple that are directly related to the slides, so I'm going to go through those ones first, and then if we've got time, I've got some more generic or general questions about Smile. Just going in reverse order. I have a question from Enam about what is the difference between MDM expansion versus the virtualized MDM endpoint?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so let's say this. They both do basically the same thing. So the concept with both MDM virtualization and with MDM expansion is I perform a search and I want the search results to include all of the records, including linked records and data that satisfies those linkages as well. Both of those features, both MDM virtualization and MDM expansion, do those two things. Here's the difference. MDM expansion is a new sort of custom parameter that clients need to add to their search. So if you're doing a search for patient 123 and you want to also include the linked records, then you need to add this _expand equals MDM, or is that, I'm actually blanking on the syntax. It's terrible that I can't remember it by heart, but there is a custom parameter you need to add to that. And you will get back results that include both of the linked patients, even if you were only expecting originally to, even if you'd only actually searched for the original patient. All of that means that MDM expansion is useful, but it's really mostly useful if you've got a client that understands the MDM concepts and therefore is able to make sense of the data that it gets back. It understands that these are linked records and should be displayed appropriately in that way. Virtualization, on the other hand, does not require, it just looks like a standard FHIR endpoint to the client. Certainly the aim with virtualization is that you would stand up multiple FHIR endpoints against the same repository, one that uses virtualization for clients that need that, and perhaps another one for management and data submission and those types of things. With virtualization, no custom search parameters are needed. The user isn't going to see multiple patient resources. If there's linkages, it's just going to return the one that was searched for, and it's going to rewrite the data to point to that original patient resource. So in other words, this new feature that's being launched enables clients that were not designed for MDM to still use MDM-enabled data. And this is a huge deal. There is increasingly just this incredible network of smart on FHIR apps being written and deployed out in the real world. And of course, those apps in many cases are general purpose apps. They're not designed to work specifically against HAPI FHIR or Smile CDR and our MDM capabilities. They're designed to work against the base FHIR specification. So using a virtualized endpoint allows those applications to take advantage of MDM capabilities without needing to know that those capabilities exist. That is the purpose of virtualization. That's a very great question. Thank you for that.
Cool. And there's just a little quick clarification that came in right at the end of your question, just asking if the MDM expansion virtualization endpoint requires changes to any sort of authentication.
Okay, so I will say this: those are, to me at least, very orthogonal concepts. Certainly, you would want authentication to take place in both of those cases. Certainly, we would recommend using, if you're a HAPI FHIR user, using the authorization interceptor. If you're a Smile CDR user, using the authorization and permission system and consent systems that are built into those platforms. If you're doing that, everything that previously worked will continue to work. I mean, the system does understand MDM capabilities. It understands sort of linkages. It will do its best to provide an appropriate sort of authorization decision. I do consider that sort of orthogonal, though. I mean, effectively, everything you previously had to do for authorization still applies in this world, but this new world should not break any existing authorization workflows. They will continue to work as they always have. Hopefully that gets at the question.
From my interpretation, it does, but hopefully that is the case. And then I'm just going to move backwards to earlier in the slide deck. And this was just a clarification about deletions, just asking if deletions are still or by default, they're enabled. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, we enable deletions are enabled. I will say, so you know what? Let me talk about this for half a second. We have really struggled with what our default configuration should look like. And I will say in both HAPI FHIR and Smile CDR today, our default configuration is entirely around complete standards compliance. So we default to enabling deletes because deletes are a part of the FHIR specification. However, we know that if disabling deletes means the system in many ways is vastly more performant because there's a whole lot of deletion checks we don't need to perform. We're having open debates right now about whether we should change our default configuration, because we know that a lot of people will not change the defaults and will go live with a system regardless. And having that system perform optimally is probably a really good goal. So I don't know that we've completely landed on the solution here, but I think we are going to spend some time thinking about our default settings over the next few releases and perhaps tuning them a little bit more for performance over complete standards compliance. Not to say we're going to make changes that break standards. That we certainly would never have default configurations that are incompatible with FHIR. But things like disabling deletes by default and letting people turn them on only if they actually need that feature of FHIR, if that gives us better performance, that might be a sensible change. So I guess the short version of that long-winded answer is, for now, deletes are enabled by default, but I actually think we may change that in the future. Of course, we're never going to get rid of the ability for you to do deletes, so you'll always have the ability of turning them on if we change our defaults, but we might change those defaults in the future.
Yeah, and then if we decide that, I'm sure that'll be a nice big bullet point in the webinar for anyone that would be affected by that.
Yep.
Cool, thank you. And then we've got another question from Holden Tuzix. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, asking if Smile customers using the Smile pair-to-pair solution. I guess it's a pair-to-pair question. I guess did we have slides on that today?
We had one.
Yeah. Do they have the ability to exchange production data with your competitors' pair-to-pair system? So are we interoperable with our other folks?
Okay, so I guess the right way to answer that, of course, this is a system that's still under development and still not complete. But absolutely, I mean, the answer, I'm going to say this with sort of couching this, that, I'm answering for the final solution as it's completed, not for the in-development solution, although the answer is probably the same for the in-development solution. We're just not completely finished with our QA yet. The answer is absolutely categorically yes. I mean, we're not building in any proprietary extensions that will make our version of this solution incompatible with other implementations. If you are a Smile customer and you have implemented our system-to-system module, which implements the payer-to-payer data exchange, the PDEX module, and you need to exchange data with a different payer who have implemented another product implementing that same implementation guide, yes, categorically, those two systems will interoperate with each other. That is the entire point of the DaVinci IGs. And we are, I mean, above all else, we are huge believers in interoperability, and standards for better data here at Smile. So that is a very high on our priority list goal.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. And then I've got a question. It's from earlier. It's more bit wider, just asking about ingestion. I'm just going to read it out because it's quite involved. But we've been looking into moving away from the FHIR endpoint and getting towards a different way of ingestion, such as bulk import or ETL import. But they're missing one key piece, which is with different data sources and data. When errors come in and we want to do some sort of dead letter, we would want to do some sort of dead letter queue, like pushing into S3, where it can be reviewed and reprocessed. What would be your suggestion for when you're taking in data and something goes wrong? How do they mitigate that?
Oh, that's fun. I will say at this point, if speed is your primary objective, you've got so much data that really the most important thing is how quickly can I get that data in. Honestly, the bulk import implementation guide, it's an interesting implementation guide. I would not say that we have performance tuned bulk import as much as we performance tuned the FHIR transaction processor at this point. And you only have to look at today's webinar and the last few to sort of see evidence of that. We just have put way more effort into performance tuning the transaction processor. So, this isn't what you're asking, but my initial answer is definitely consider, even if you've got bulk import files, consider for now turning them into FHIR transaction bundles and using a message broker, probably Kafka, although Apache ActiveMQ is certainly equally good. That is by far the fastest way to get your data in. And certainly if you do that, perhaps you use Camel to wire it all up together, you do absolutely have the ability to get data back out of the system in terms of your statuses. I was talking about that submit final retry as batch. That, the use case you're talking about, that's actually the entire use case for that feature. The idea being that we want to use transactions for super fast processing of data, but if we have failures, we want to take just those individual failures and move them off into a dead letter queue. This exact flag was added so that a customer could do exactly that. So, bottom line, a lot of what you're talking about is really mostly today going to be most performant, and in some ways only really possible if you're doing this with transactions over a message broker. I don't think it needs to remain that way. I'd love to sort of maybe take this offline and have a discussion about what enhancements we could make to bulk import. I don't mean any of this to say that I don't think bulk import is capable or I don't think it's a good solution. I think it's just we haven't seen as many sort of interesting use cases for it because most people have started with transactions anyway, and so that's where we've put most of our focus. If having a dead letter queue for bulk imports would be useful, I think that would be really fun to think about. So I'd love to have a conversation about what that might look like. That was a pretty rambly answer, and I think only half touched on the question, but hopefully gets to the high points of my thoughts on it.
That's okay. I'm sure I read it out as quite a rambly question as well. So I think it matched quite nicely there. We're caught up on the questions in the chat. The only thing that I have been asked is to remind you that Smile's been around for 8 years, not 7.
Thank you. Whoever did that, thank you. I am so bad at dates.
You're getting called out there a little bit. But other than that, since we're nearing the end of the webinar, I'm just going to go with my traditional question of what you're looking forward to coming up in the next release or for the rest of the year. Because I guess this is our first release of the year, so you can go as far forward as you want for 2025.
I love it. Okay, here's a flippant answer first. I'm really excited for our release names. I'm not going to give you any hints about what they are, other than to say that our November release of 2025 has probably my favorite release name we've ever used. So stay tuned for more release names. I think that's going to be fun. I'm going to say, the other thing, I spoke about this at the very start. I am so excited about our ongoing work for documentation enhancements. I was talking about this at the very start. We have been trying from the very start to be a different kind of company in terms of the way we do documentation. And I've always been really proud of the high caliber documentation that HAPI FHIR provides for our open source community, and the even higher caliber documentation that Smile CDR provides for our commercial community. We have put so much work into both of those documentation sets. And I rarely like to do trash talking, but I think in this case I will. The results speak for themselves. I think we have the best documentation in our sort of product category of anything. Like we really do have good documentation. That said, it has a number of problems as well. And the biggest problem is that all of the documentation we've got is what you would sort of traditionally call reference documentation. If you need to understand how a feature works or what settings exist or, those what our database schema looks like, I mean, those are all fairly easy answers or easy questions to answer with our documentation. On the other hand, we don't have today a lot of good guides. If I want to understand how would I build a health information exchange and make sure it's secure using the platform, I mean we know how to do that, but we certainly don't have good documentation that takes you through the steps and the considerations and that type of thing. So we have got a huge project underway to remedy that. And I mean, to me, this is just going to be the next revolution of Smile is, documentation that is an order of magnitude more helpful than the previous already good documentation. I don't know. I always feel a little embarrassed tooting our own horn quite that hard, but I think in this case it merits it. I am very proud of the work done by our documentation team. So there we go.
Yeah, I've read a couple of the guides and I find them quite helpful personally. So I am looking forward to there being more of that as well.
Cool.
Yeah. I do think that we are all caught up on my questions and we are all caught up on the chat, and we're almost at the hour, especially with all the extra slides today. But thank you so much for your time. I want to thank everyone who contributed in the chat as well. Of course, everyone who contributed to the release, especially the community contributions. That's always my favorite part of the webinar, is seeing the community contributions. But just thanks all around to everyone involved, both in helping this webinar by adding your questions and comments, and also just for everyone who contributed to this release. And James, of course, to you for presenting it to us all as well.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time. And for anyone going to HIMSS again, I'll see you there.